The moment they told her to roll up her sleeve, she felt a strange stillness settle inside her. It wasn't fear. She had long outgrown that. It was a quiet awareness, a familiar weight she had carried for years. She knew what lay beneath the fabric, knew the ink etched into her skin was more than a symbol. It was a story no one had dared to hear, a truth no one had been brave enough to face. As her fingers slowly peeled the sleeve upward, the room's atmosphere shifted. Conversations faded, boots stilled, and every pair of eyes locked onto the image emerging from her arm. The Cerberus tattoo, 3 snarling heads joined by a ring of fire, stared back at them like a living creature. She didn't need to look around to know what the reaction was. The sharp inhale, the stiffness in their shoulders, the stunned silence. It was the same every time someone recognized it. The insignia belonged to a platoon that no longer existed, a unit spoken about only in whispers, buried deep in classified reports and haunted memories. The Cerberus platoon was not just any elite division. They were the kind of soldiers deployed only when missions were impossible, when failure meant more than death. And yet they had fallen, every single one of them except her. But the world didn't know that. The official record listed Cerberus as KIA with no survivors. The government had sealed the files, erased the identities, and let the legend fade. Those who had once fought beside her were reduced to footnotes, their sacrifice swallowed by secrecy. And she, the lone survivor, became a ghost walking through a world that believed she had died long ago. So when the officers inspecting recruits barked the order to lift her sleeve, she already knew this moment was coming. She could have hidden it. She could have refused. She could have avoided the stir that followed the sight of that ink. But she never did, because the tattoo wasn't just for her. It was for them, for the brothers and sisters she lost in the smoke, gunfire, and betrayal that claimed Cerberus. Every stroke of the tattoo marked a memory. The oath they swore, the missions they bled through, the final battle that ended everything. As the last inch of fabric rose, revealing the complete emblem, she finally lifted her gaze. The officers' faces were pale, their expressions a blend of disbelief and fear. They weren't looking at a recruit anymore. They were looking at an impossibility, a ghost, a survivor who shouldn't exist. And in that silence, the past surged back. Flashes of explosions, shouts in the radio, teammates calling her name. She felt them all standing with her, as if the tattoo on her skin burned with their presence. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The tattoo told the story for her, louder than any words could. It told them she had walked through hell and returned. It told them she carried an entire platoon's legacy on her arm. It told them everything, and yet nothing at all. The Cerberus emblem was not something anyone could mistake for ordinary ink. Its lines were sharp, deliberate, carved into her skin with the precision of someone who understood the weight it carried. Those who recognized it didn't just see a tattoo. They saw a classified chapter of military history that most believed was long buried. The Cerberus platoon was a myth whispered in dark corners of bases, mentioned only by soldiers old enough to remember the missions no one else talked about. They were the units sent into war zones that never made it into public news, into battles where backup was never promised, into operations so dangerous the military quietly pretended they never happened. To belong to Cerberus meant you had earned a place among the deadliest, most resilient, and most loyal operators ever trained. And yet, the emblem on her arm wasn't a badge of pride. It was a memorial. It was the last remaining trace of a platoon that had been wiped out in a single catastrophic operation, one that had left no bodies, no final calls, no survivors. At least that's what the world had been told. The official reports were stamped, sealed, and locked away under layers of clearance no ordinary officer could access. Whenever the name Cerberus appeared in old files, it was accompanied by redacted paragraphs and grim footnotes. For most soldiers, the emblem existed only in rumor, a three-headed guardian of the underworld, symbolizing the platoon's vow to watch each other's backs even in death. So when she stood there, the tattoo exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights, it felt like she had ripped open a door that had been welded shut. The officers who recognized the symbol found themselves frozen not because of her, but because of what the tattoo implied. According to every record they had ever seen, according to every briefing and classified report, no human alive should have been able to wear that mark. The survivors' list was empty. The casualty report was final. Cerberus was an echo of the past, a story used to warn new recruits of how dangerous the world could be. But now the echo was standing right in front of them. The realization hit them in waves. First came shock, the kind that widened eyes and tightened jaws. Then confusion, because the existence of a survivor meant the official story was incomplete or intentionally false. And finally, fear, not fear of her, but fear of what her presence meant. If the military had hidden the truth about Cerberus, what else had been buried? What had actually happened in that final mission? Why was she the only one who made it out? And why had she chosen to remain silent until now? As they stared at the tattoo, they weren't just seeing a piece of ink. They were seeing classified operations, lost soldiers, betrayal, sacrifice, and a storm of unanswered questions. They were seeing the ghost of a platoon. They thought they understood. But the tattoo revealed otherwise. It hinted that the real story was darker, deeper, and far more painful than the reports ever suggested. And she, the lone survivor, carried every piece of that truth on her skin. Her silence had always been unusual, but until that moment, no one had understood why. She moved differently from the others, not just with discipline, but with a sort of unspoken awareness, like someone who had learned to anticipate danger before it even showed itself. Her reflexes were too sharp, her eyes too steady, her steps too quiet. Even when she stood still, her presence felt like coiled tension, as if she existed in a state of quiet readiness. Most people wrote it off as natural talent or strict training. But once the tattoo of the Cerberus platoon was exposed, all the scattered pieces of her behavior suddenly aligned in the minds of those watching her. They saw her differently now. The stoic way she handled aggression during drills, the way her gaze always swept the room as if mapping exits, the way her hands never shook even during live fire exercises, all of it made sense. She wasn't just disciplined, she was seasoned, hardened, someone who had seen things that don't leave a person unchanged. And the more they remembered her actions, the clearer it became that she hadn't been trying to impress anyone. She had been surviving, the same way she had learned to during the final days of the Cerberus platoon. Memories of her fallen team flickered through her mind, uninvited but unavoidable. She remembered how they used to move like a single organism, how each soldier knew the other's next step without needing to speak. The bond of Cerberus wasn't built on training alone. It was built on shared nightmares, on missions that pushed them to the edge, on nights where they sat around dying campfires knowing they might not see dawn. She carried all of that inside her still, and every instinct she had, every automatic reaction she'd honed, came from surviving battles she was never meant to walk away from. When the others looked at her now, they didn't just see a recruit. They saw a contradiction, someone too calm in chaos, too experienced for her age, too weathered for someone who supposedly had no past. They remembered how she always positioned herself with her back to a wall, how she scanned rooftops before stepping outdoors, how she never flinched at explosions during training. These were habits formed only by soldiers who had lived through real hell, and as they stared at her, the truth settled in their minds like a heavy stone. She wasn't simply trained, she was forged. Forged by loss, by fire, by betrayal, by the kind of battle that erases entire platoons from history. The deeper they thought, the more they realized her existence was a living reminder of a tragedy they had only heard in half-old stories. Her eyes carried the weight of ghosts. Her stance echoed the readiness of someone who had been the last one, standing more times than anyone should. In that moment, they finally understood that her unmatched instincts were not gifts. They were scars. They were the remnants of a soldier who had survived when everyone else around her had fallen. And now, standing in that silent room, she felt the weight of their realization settle upon her like a shadow she had long grown used to, not a burden, but a reminder that her past was never truly buried. It lived through her in every breath, every movement, every unspoken memory. The officers stood frozen, their earlier arrogance dissolving the moment they understood what the emblem meant. A few minutes ago, they had spoken to her like she was just another recruit, someone to test, to command, to evaluate. But now the room felt different. The air itself seemed to thicken as they stared at the tattoo, realizing every assumption they'd made about her had been wrong. She had endured their doubts, their scrutiny, their cold questions, all without protest. She hadn't needed to defend herself, because the truth inked into her skin said everything they never bothered to ask. They had treated her like she was inexperienced, fragile, even someone unproven. They pushed her harder than the others, questioned her discipline, and dismissed her quietness as weakness. Some officers had even whispered about removing her from the program, claiming she lacked the aggression needed for elite service. But now those same officers felt a heavy unease crawling up their spines. They weren't looking at a recruit anymore. They were looking at someone who had carried an entire platoon's legacy while the world erased it. Someone who had walked through a fire none of them had dared to face. A silence settled between them, deep and electric. Their eyes flickered with the realization that they were standing in the presence of a soldier, shaped by grief and forged by war. It was no longer about her potential. It was about the truth they had ignored. The Cerberus platoon wasn't just another unit. It was the kind of formation commanders spoke about only behind closed doors, with lowered voices and grim expressions. A platoon that had been sacrificed in a mission nobody wanted to take responsibility for. A platoon whose deaths had been blamed on unforeseen complications, rather than the betrayal that had sealed their fate. She saw that recognition on their faces. The guilt, the discomfort, the sudden fear that they had disrespected someone worthy of more than rank could measure. They were officers, but even they were not prepared for the weight of history she carried. They knew what the tattoo meant. She had survived something no one was meant to survive, and she had done it alone. And if she chose to speak, if she revealed what she knew, she could unravel secrets that had been locked away for years. But she didn't speak. She didn't accuse them, didn't demand recognition. She simply stood still, her expression unreadable, her gaze steady. And that silence carried more power than any uniform or medal. It told them she hadn't returned for applause. She hadn't returned for pity. She was here because she had a purpose, one they could feel, but not yet understand. Their frozen expressions revealed something deeper than shock, respect mixed with quiet fear. The officers who once doubted her now understood they had underestimated someone whose strength was rooted not in training manuals or academy scores, but in the kind of loss that burns itself into a soldier's soul. And they knew one more thing: whatever mission she was stepping into now, she wasn't doing it as a recruit. She was doing it as the last shadow of Cerberus, carrying unfinished truths that no one in that room had the courage to confront. They couldn't bury her past anymore. It had risen right in front of them. It wasn't just a tattoo. They realized that immediately. Tattoos were common among soldiers, marks of pride, remembrance, or rebellion. But the Cerberus emblem carried an energy that felt almost alive, as if the three snarling heads inked into her skin were guardians watching from another world. The moment the officers saw it, they knew this wasn't a design chosen for decoration. It was a declaration, a warning, and a history lesson all at once. And most of all, it was proof of something far more terrifying. She had survived the impossible. Whispers rippled silently through the room as the officers exchanged uneasy glances. The Cerberus platoon had a reputation that bordered on legend, the kind of unit spoken about in hushed tones during late, night guard shifts. They were relentless, disciplined, and fiercely loyal, and they died the same way. Officially, none of them had made it back. Unofficially, rumors persisted that something had gone terribly wrong on that final mission, something that was never meant to see daylight. And now, staring at her tattoo, it became clear that she was living evidence of a truth the military had buried deep beneath classified seals. She felt their eyes on her, felt the shift in their energy. For years, she had carried that emblem as a personal reminder of the people. She had lost the brothers and sisters who had fought beside her until their last breath. The mark had been etched into her arm not as a celebration, but as a vow, a promise to never forget, and a warning to anyone who tried to rewrite the past. And the officers now understood that message better than she expected. If she had survived what killed Cerberus, she wasn't someone to underestimate. She wasn't someone to question lightly. She wasn't someone to challenge without understanding the consequences. Her calmness wasn't passivity. It was control. Her silence wasn't insecurity. It was experience. And her presence wasn't coincidence. It was destiny. She had returned not as a lost soldier trying to rebuild her life, but as the final embodiment of a platoon that refused to be erased. One officer swallowed hard, suddenly remembering every time they had spoken to her with clipped authority or impatience. Another stepped back slightly, no longer viewing her as a subordinate, but as a force that demanded respect simply by existing. For the first time, they weren't thinking about her potential, they were thinking about what she had already survived. They were thinking about explosions, gunfire, betrayal, and the kind of darkness that swallows entire units whole. And she had walked out of that alone. The tattoo was more than a symbol of the fallen. It was a silent challenge to the living. It dared them to question her strength, knowing they would never truly understand what shaped it. It warned them that she wasn't just a survivor. She was a witness to truths they couldn't speak, and battles they couldn't imagine. And as she lowered her sleeve again, the message lingered in the air like smoke. Underestimate her, and you underestimate the entire legacy of Cerberus.